The Lone Ranger is the Western version of the Green Hornet. That holds true of the entire franchise, of both of those franchises, which, as you probably know, are set in the same universe. But it also holds true of the recent movie adaptations of both of them. The Green Hornet movie took Britt Reed and turned him from being the kind of a Don Draper figure, very suave, but very strong and masculine, who was competent and had a competent assistant, a sidekick, I guess. That doesn't sound too condescending. Who was his servant? And they had a mutual respect. And of course, he was from a different ethnic background that was very exotic. And in the movie, they turned it around so that Kato, the exotic one, was the one who basically was. He was the force, right? He was he brought the magic or whatever. And Seth Rogen played the part of Britt Reed. And he became a comedic character. He became a clown who had maybe elevated ambitions. He had lofty ambitions. And a certain sense of justice in spite of himself. And so he fumbled along while Kato really disrespected him, but worked with him because out of necessity. And eventually they end up kind of respecting each other a bit more. They have a bromance, they play off each other. And I guess I should say, I want to say they learn from each other, but they kind of don't. Seth Rogen just learns from Kato. And eventually the Green Hornet becomes a semi-competent superhero, because that's the way that a movie arc has to work. And this is the same thing, basically. John Reed is not as fumbling and bumbling and morally disreputable as Britt Reed was in the Green Hornet movie. But there's the same premise that he's not a competent crime fighter on his own. That said, and I did not watch The Lone Ranger, not much anyways when I was a kid. I did watch The Green Hornet. I have a friend who grew up on The Lone Ranger and is just dreading this movie. I was dreading The Green Hornet. I made a video about it back in the day where I ranted quite a bit about how all my concerns about it and all this sort of thing. But I ended up seeing The Green Hornet, and in spite of myself, I did like it. I surprised myself, but I actually did like it. I loved the show as a kid, and the movie craps all over it, but I did actually enjoy the movie. Even the kind of like token crumbs from the table that it throws at the end where you get to hear the song. Same thing here. If you want to hear the William Tell Overture, it comes at the end, in the last like 10 minutes or so. They do end up playing it. But it deliberately ridicules elements of the original, and that's a thing nowadays. I mean, the King Kong remake made fun of the exact dialogue from the original movie, and at the very end of this movie, the very last dialogue that's exchanged, essentially, is the Lone Ranger shouting, "Hi Ho Silver," and Tonto giving him this indignant look and saying, "Don't ever do that again," And everyone laughs, except for people who, I guess, loved the show growing up and thought that was really cool, who now feel very slighted and offended. And also, like the Green Hornet, in spite of myself, I didn't mind it. I thought this was okay. Interesting themes. It undermines the themes of the original as well, in some ways. More so than the Green Hornet did. And I was expecting to be annoyed by that. But it's kind of the opposite. I actually kind of like it. Because the original Lone Ranger show has a theme. My friend who really likes it will say it's deep. I don't know if I'd say it's deep, but there are ideas. It is a thoughtful show. And what the Lone Ranger represents is order and civilization and justice. And the rule of law. Alright? I saw an interview with Armie Hammer where he was talking about how, earlier Westerns kind of glossed over the fact that the natives got screwed over by the white people, and we really talk about this in this movie. We're a new kind of Western. Have you not seen The Searchers, dude? A bunch of Martin Scorsese and Schrader movies ripped it off, so you should probably watch it and see. Have you ever watched the original Lone Ranger? Because the Lone Ranger was very... the original Lone Ranger series was very alert to the fact of racism against the natives. And the Lone Ranger himself, in his friendship with Tonto, and that's what it was. It was a friendship between two characters. It wasn't even that he deliberately set out to undermine racism. he just didn't care. Like, I mean, it was just not on his radar, right? He was concerned with justice and equity, and him and Tonto were both gifted, talented people, and they had done each other a good turn. I mean, this is how the original series sets itself up. Originally, John and his brother are lawmen. They're Texas Rangers. They're betrayed, and it's imitated in this movie. They're led into this kind of ravine, and they're shot at by an ambush. And the guy who betrayed them in the original is then killed by Cavendish, who's the leader of the gang they're trying to catch, on the grounds that, well, if he betrayed them, he could betray us, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of like Plato's Republic, you know, how there has to even be honor among thieves kind of a thing. Even a robber band has to sort of borrow principles of justice. And Tonto discovers him and basically nurses him back to health, because at one point when Tonto was young, his whole family was killed, and John Reed came and took care of him. And basically this is him doing him something merciful because he did something merciful for him once. It's mercy for mercy. And even the way they discover Silver, they discover a horse that's been maimed by a buffalo, as I recall, and they nurse him back to health. And then Tonto says, well, are you going to take him as your horse? And he says, I'll let the horse decide, basically. He lets the horse go, and the horse runs around, and then the horse comes willingly back to him. So there's themes here of, like, freedom, free choice, of kindness, and of justice as well. When he ends up catching Cavendish, there's not really a strong sense of you killed my brother, therefore I'm going to catch you. It's, you're a criminal, therefore I'm going to catch you. It's very, very strict rule of law stuff. And he's very often, I mean, and that's what he's lauded for. I mean, that's the strength of the character on the show, is that several times, watch the movie from 1956. It's currently on YouTube. And this movie, and by the way, the new movie, the 2013 one, borrows a lot actually from that movie. A lot of the themes from it, a lot of the plot points are the same. Like a giant silver mountain that a respected member of the community is trying to get a hold of. Spoilers! Spoiler alert! This is gonna be full of spoilers. But the plot is very similar in that respect. But in that one, what point was I making just there? I can't even remember what I was saying just now. But the point is that there's a point where, like, the natives, and this is a point that's borrowed in this movie, which is my point about how stupid it is to say, well, this movie is a new breed of Western that's going to say stuff about the oppression of natives you've never heard before, but it takes a plot point, like, about that exactly from the 1956 movie. In the 1956 movie, a prominent person in the community who wants to get rid of the natives, because the native reserve is right where there's a mountain of silver that they believe is a magical mountain. This guy wants to get a hold of that, so he'll have enough silver to basically become a king. So he sends out his henchmen disguised as natives to go out and do raids and kill people to discredit the natives, so that there'll be a war with them and they'll drive them out. It'll also stop the state from becoming a part of. It won't become part of America at this point. It won't become a state. And this point where just everything is hitting the family. It looks like the natives are going to go to war with the Americans, like with the whites, and the Lone Ranger actually has 4 of the henchmen in his captivity, and the sheriff, who's been completely undermined because this guy is so much more powerful than the sheriff, wants to just kill them, basically. And the Lone Ranger has them in this power, and he wants to get his gun and get revenge, basically, because this guy has killed one of his friends, one of his deputies. And the Lone Ranger doesn't let him kill them, doesn't let him take revenge, and just through his own ingenuity, ends up stopping the natives from going to battle, and he resolves the whole situation without breaking the law. And that's a very strong emphasis. He will not kill somebody if he can. He is going to always capture them for the sake of a fair trial. That's what he embodies. And that's the code that Clayton Moore lived by, right? And when Clayton Moore played the Lone Ranger, he was a great Lone Ranger. Nowadays, it's very fashionable to kind of look back at actors who played John Wayne type roles, like very strong, noble characters, with some disdain. I mean, John Wayne gets criticized a lot, and honestly, I don't know that he didn't have a lot of range. I mean, if you watch movies where he's not a cowboy, like Brannigan, I mean, yeah, he's kind of wooden and kind of stiff. You know, people criticize, like, Charlton Heston, and of course William Shatner, right? And Adam West this is why I think he's still popular, because he was self-conscious. I mean, he's deliberately parodying the John Wayne character when he played Batman in the 60s. That's fashionable enough. Clayton Moore doesn't get that ridiculed. I think it's because he's so good. I mean, he's really, like, he's quite good at being a virtuous, strong guy who inspires confidence, a real masculine guy. And the Lone Ranger kind of embodies masculinity that way. He's the only guy who has his own Hollywood star that mentions his character, Clayton Moore, the Lone Ranger. Right? And he tried to embody that code in his own personal life. He was apparently a very virtuous, upright guy. Well, in this movie, that's how John Reed starts, without all of the badassery. He's a lawyer, and he's first seen on a train reading John Locke's Two Treaties of Government, and some Presbyterians who are singing hymns ask him if he wants to sing with them, and he says, well, no, I'm much obliged, but this is my Bible. And that's his creed, that's his code. And later on, he explains why he doesn't use a gun, and he quotes Locke by talking about how basically we should get humans, when they assemble in society, transcend kind of animalistic, barbaric ways, and no longer observe the laws of nature, but now observe the laws of men. That's what he initially believes. And then he goes up against the Cavendish gang, and this is where the movie's really schizophrenic, because there's a lot of slapstick comedy, and some of the jokes are very funny, actually. There's a good comedic timing and a good sensibility, and the action scenes are shot, the comedic action, I should say, it's shot really well. It's well choreographed. This movie's touted as it's from the makers of Parts of the Caribbean. It really does have that feel at times. That same, even in the lesser sequels, some of this the really well staged and comedic and slapsticky, Buster Keaton action sequences, like the second Pirates film with the wheel. There's stuff like that in this movie. It's done really well in that respect. But then it's interspliced with really dark scenes, especially with Cavendish, who is just turned up to 11 in how evil and despicable he is. And the makeup's actually really good because they make his gang look almost they're all scarred up. They all look like they're Frankenstein monsters almost. They just look like hell. And he's a cannibal, right? And literally, he's a cannibal. He eats hearts. He eats legs. He eats his own blood at one point. And this is too much, basically. John Reed cannot combat this. At one point, he actually has the ability to kill him, and he doesn't because you're going to go to trial. And he keeps mentioning this is the future, right? This is progress. In the future, when we're in a progressive society, we won't need guns. We'll be so advanced. We'll be so civilized that we don't need this. Obviously the Lone Ranger on the show had a gun with silver bullets, but he didn't shoot to kill, and he very rarely used the gun. He used the gun as little as possible. And the reason they were silver was to kind of represent justice and the sanctity of human life in a certain sense. And that's where this guy starts. And he's so ineffectual for that reason. Now, he has integrity, and he has certain skills. You can presume he's a competent lawyer, and he's well-educated, but he's completely ineffectual at stopping Cavendish and his gang. Utterly ineffectual. And throughout the movie, that impedes him. And that's a very deliberate assault on this. Whereas Tonto is trying to get revenge. Tonto, Saul, as a boy, his backstory here is not that his family was killed and John Reed helped him out. His family was killed here because of his fault. He naively told certain white people who he had cared for. And this is the interesting thing. It's no longer mercy repaid with mercy. Mercy is not necessarily a good thing. Young Tonto does an act of mercy to two white people. He nurses them back to health. Then they discover that there's basically the river starts in a mountain that's pure silver, and they get Tonto to tell him the location of where the river starts, and they trade that information with him for a watch. And watches are a strong motif in this movie. Tonto carries a watch, and the watches show up a lot. There's a watch that's given to one of the characters who's very progressive, who's an industrialist. He's given a watch at one point as a token of gratitude. And of course, the watch, we can think of the deistic picture of the universe, right? The mechanistic Newtonian one. And also of the clockwork by which the mechanization of industrialization, right, of the modern age, of modernization creeping across America, kind of a thing. Tonto accepts that, and he doesn't like the watch. He keeps saying that it wasn't a good trade. And basically, after these white people discover where all the silver is coming from, they don't want the natives to know about this as well, so they kill all of them. Tonto's the only survivor. And that's the chip he carries on his shoulder now. And he's going to get revenge. And he keeps trying to kill Cavendish, and John Reed keeps stopping him. Because that's not justice, right? That's not the rule of law. By the end of the movie, he discovers that the lawmen as well, the people who represent civilized, mainstream, non-criminal society, are all also criminal. they're also corrupt. The soldiers in this movie are corrupt. The industrialists in this movie are corrupt, right? And they're lying and they're deceiving and they're murdering for the sake of acquiring silver so that they can gain power, right? This is the whole theme of that. And once he realizes that the justice he's trying to impose on this lawless world around him is, in fact, just as tainted and corrupt. It's literally the industrialist character who's initially presented as being a good guy, although you know he's not, because he's played by Tom Wilkinson, and when Tom Wilkinson's evil, it's obvious. But then it turns out that he is literally Cavendish's brother. And they've actually been working together. So Cavendish leads a band of outlaws, and his brother leads a band of basically robber barons, right? Of industrialists who are actually evil. And so literally, like, respectable society is the brother of criminal society. And when John Reed realizes that, he basically realizes that his whole Lockean philosophy has been a lie. And at that point, he becomes the terrorist. He literally becomes... I mean, that's when he ends up really embracing the Lone Ranger persona. And he's a terrorist. He blows up bridges and causes the trains to crash over them and causes all the silver to go back into the river. And again, that's very much a deliberate FU to the original character. Saying that everything he stood for, which was like... not everything, because, I mean, they're still in favor of justice, but justice looks a lot like revenge here, right? Which is exactly what the Lone Ranger stood against. And that the society the Lone Ranger was standing for, as portrayed by Clayton Moore, is exactly the kind of thing that this Lone Ranger ends up rejecting. But there's still something to that. There's something that can be that's appealing and worthwhile about that. Basically, which is that respectability, that being a good citizen, is not necessarily be all and end all. Just like respectable civic society, which, let's be honest, was and is built on the foundation in some ways of oppression of other nations and other people groups so that we can lead a comfortable, respectable life. That's a common theme. I mean, this is not news to anybody anymore, but there may be something to that. There may be a place to still remember that. There's a video, I'll post a link to it, of William F. Buckley debating Saul Alinsky. And Alinsky has a very Marxist view of history and of progress, where justice can only be achieved by conflict that is often violent. Whereas William F. Buckley is more in favor of saying, well, no, like, isn't that not true? I mean, can't justice be arrived at by peaceful and equitable means, kind of a thing. Now, William F. Buckley's position, which I suppose maybe you could say is easy for him to hold as a rather wealthy, well-educated white man, is the view of... It's kind of like the Martin Luther King view, whereas Alinsky's like the Malcolm X, or like William F. Buckley is like a Professor Xavier, and Magneto is Alinsky. And in this movie, the Lone Ranger... Well, John Reed is the William F. Buckley position. Justice and order and society and good government and Lockean principles. And he ends up becoming the Lone Ranger, who is Alinsky, who is kind of... it's overstating it to say, like, Magneto or somebody, but the Malcolm X, basically. But, like, yeah, go outside the law because the law is not working to fix it. That's where he ends up. And it's there's something anti-Marxist about that, in some respects. That's the way that to achieve justice and to achieve right and equitable society. It's too bad this movie won't never get a sequel, almost certainly, because it's not doing well at the box office at all. It seems to refute Mark Kermode's formula for not having a flop. But because I'm very curious where the Lone Ranger is supposed to end up, because this movie is... The framing device is that Tonto, who in this movie is a real badass, who does really well for himself, has aged in 1933 now. He's an elderly guy posing as a human statue in an exhibit at a carnival that's sort of like, pictures of yesteryear. And so there's like a stuffed bear who's set out across the background, a display that's supposed to look like the Wild West. It's supposed to look like the deserts of Arizona or whatever. And there's like a stuffed bison as well. And there's the noble savage. And that's actually Tonto. Tonto's being a human statue there. And he sees a little boy wearing a mask, and for a second thinks that he's the Lone Ranger. He automatically says Kimosabi. And then kind of realizes what's happened. It's not really... It actually seems like it's going to be a very sad scene at first, but it ends up being comedic, which is a template for this movie that doesn't get the tone right. That initially seems like a really sad scene of this elderly native guy who can't really think straight anymore, remembering the good old days. But then it changes into comedic. Then it becomes like the kind of amusing music, and it becomes Johnny Depp kind of hamming it up. And he tells the story. He's recounting the story to the kid. So there's a little bit of an unreliable narrator trope going on here. Like how much of this is just Tonto making it up. And at the very end of the movie, the kid asks, was it true or not? And he says, well, you decide, kind of a thing. But it is a question of like, where, what does Tonto do after he retired? Like, what society did the Lone Ranger achieve? Or did he just fail? I mean, did the Lone Ranger just not end up... I mean, the Lone Ranger in the original show, we could say that the society he fought for won. Or at least in the 1950s, they would have thought so. Right? On the heels of winning the Second World War, and American ideals and American society triumphing and looking like everything's going to be great, the society the Lone Ranger fought for has won. And it will continue to win forever, kind of a thing. Progress, just like in this movie, with the trains, like the Ayn Rand thing. Trains symbolize progress, right? What does the Lone Ranger fight for in this one? And does he ever achieve that society? Because Tonto doesn't seem to have... I mean, Tonto seems to have got the short end of the stick, which the natives do in this movie, just generally. The Indians, the Injuns, get really boned in this movie. Which I suppose you could say they were in history, which is maybe what it's going for. And maybe that's why the movie's so violent and dark at times. It's trying to give an accurate picture of what the Wild West was like. Even though Tonto is deliberately ahistorical, he's based on a painting that a white guy did called I Am Crow, of what he imagines a Native American to have been like, even though he admitted it was completely off the top of his head and not based on anything historical. So the movie's, which is, again, the movie's schizophrenic. The movie doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know if it's going to be a gritty, authentic movie or it's going to be a reimagining of what happened or whatever. But for all that, there is an interesting aspect to where this movie really spiritualizes it up quite a bit. In as much as Tonto is very magical, right? Tonto seems to have magic powers almost, but at the same time he's not a wizard, right? Like he's still very subservient to what he calls the Great Father. He has all these kind of rituals and all these prayers that he engages in. And he carries a crow on his head, which he found the corpse of the crow when he came back to find his entire people slain. And there's a theme there as well about a bird in a cage, right? Dan Reed, his widow, is told by the villain that on his salary, she seems to be not living as well as she could be, and he'd hate to see her in a cage. He hates to see a bird in a cage. And Tonto hides his head in a cage at one point, and he actually carries a cage with his raven in it at a certain point as well. There's that theme, and he keeps feeding it. He keeps trying to feed, or like putting bird feed into the beak of this dead bird. Although there are a couple times when it comes back to life, right? Just like he is able to bring John Reed back from the dead. There's a very clear resurrection theme there. And apparently Tonto's had a vision where there's going to be a great warrior who's going to join him in fighting for justice. And he assumes it's going to be Dan Reed, because Dan Reed is shown to be an extremely competent and effective lawman. But Dan Reed is killed. Dan Reed is very dead. His heart is eaten. Whereas John Reed survives. John Reed, who has only just been deputized, who's just got up from behind his barrister's desk and is still like in respectable clothes and not really a hardened guy at all. He gets shot and he survives. And there's reference made to a spirit horse who kind of walks between the land of the living and the dead. And it's a white horse, right? You follow me. And it shows up and stands at the grave that Tonto has dug for John Reed, signifying... And Tonto keeps insisting on it, you must be wrong, you must mean the brother. But the horse keeps obstinately standing by John Reed and keeps showing up to save him throughout the movie. Which reminds me of the story of King David and his anointing as king. Surely it must be the prophet who assumes it must be one of the brothers or whatever. But no, it's this guy. This guy who seems unqualified for the job. He's the one who has been picked by the Great Father, which is the Tonto says at one point, who am I to question the Great Father? I don't see how it can be you. But who am I to question the Great Father? And of course here, Kimosabe means wrong brother, because he thinks it should have been Dan Reed. And that's kind of sad, because I like how in the original show it meant trusty scout, and there's something, I don't know, there's something dependable about that I like. But no, in this movie it's wrong brother. He thinks it should have been Dan Reed. And he's not qualified for it, but somehow magically John Reed keeps doing the right thing. He keeps pulling it out. At one point he fires what's meant to be a warning shot, and it ends up ricocheting everywhere, and causing the deaths of 2 of the villains. And it's an amazing shot that he wasn't intending at all. And what Tonto deduces is that he's a spirit walker, which means that because he's come back from the dead, he can never be killed in battle. He's essentially immortal when it comes to fighting. There's a sense of grace there, right? It's not that he's like the all-American hero, rah, 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 he can do it all by himself. There's some supernatural power guiding him. Now, Christianity generally gets represented badly in this movie. As kind of stuffy and ridiculous and ineffectual, and is racist. Oftentimes, the heathen are railed against or even attacked in the name of God. Especially Presbyterians. Presbyterians get quite a hard knocking in this movie. But there is a scene where the villain, in fact, is praying, probably insincerely, that God will lead the Lone Ranger back home, back to safety. And as he's praying, he says, "Oh, Father, I know you will guide the weary traveler back home. I know you'll be a light in his darkness." We are shown the Lone Ranger actually traveling home successfully as these words are being narrated over him. Which kind of suggests that, in fact, God is guiding the Lone Ranger. God is behind him in some way. And that's kind of the theme of this movie, is that before the kind of industrialization, before the mechanization, before the scientification of America kind of a thing, and of society, prior to that, in almost this Old Testament system where justice very much means the avenger of blood goes out and exacts revenge. And Westerns always have kind of an Old Testament feel, which is why the Book of Eli is really a Western in some ways, because it's essentially an Old Testament story. Somewhere in that, though, is where true justice is found, because God is there, because the gods are there, because the supernatural is to be found there. And that's kind of what the Lone Ranger represents, ultimately, is that. Whereas originally he stood for American liberal society, here he stands for primitive, quote-unquote, traditional society. Ends up representing that anyways. And the traditional understanding of justice is an eye for an eye. It's very interesting that way, I thought, anyways. And I do wonder whether the movie, when it has Tonto standing in as the noble savage, is it critiquing or ridiculing the kind of Rousseau idea of the noble savage? Because I think it is. Because that's sort of idea that in the state of nature things would be nice and equitable and naturally fair, and it's only when we create society that that violence actually comes from, as opposed to the kind of Hobbesian view that like we're naturally violent and the state is imposed on us to stop us from being violent, which is more Augustinian, honestly, more biblical probably. Although I guess in a way the movie does represent it that way. I mean, native society is shown as being much more peaceful on its own and it's society that brings violence to it. So perhaps the movie's not critiquing it. Maybe the movie, when it calls him the noble savage, is being unironic. Maybe the movie is actually Rousseauian that way, in some respect. I don't know. Anyway, so those are the themes of the movie as I saw it. Like I said, it's pretty long, and there's actually long sequences that aren't all that action-packed. And where the action is actually more subdued than I was expecting. I mean, in the trailer and stuff, you see like trains flipping around, but that's near the beginning. That happens near the beginning, the kind of the fugitive style thing with a train derailing and a convict escaping. But a lot of the action scenes are a lot more. They've got that traditional like silent movie thing going on almost, which Pirates of the Caribbean had too. You know, the guys walking with the canoes over their heads and whatever. The climactic scene I thought was great. It was a lot of fun. William Tell overture. And that's where, like, if you're a fan of the original show and you don't want to see this movie, I'd rent it and just watch like the last 20 minutes or so, because like you'll at least enjoy that part of the Lone Ranger being awesome, and I mean he has a much easier time slipping into being an awesome strong, because I mean Seth Rogen is deliberately comedic. Armie Hammer looks like he could be posing for like a 1940s poster, like a World War II poster as a soldier. He's got that clean cut face. He's very strong. I do wonder, it's kind of a shame to me that we don't have a movie that depicts either the Green Hornet or especially the Lone Ranger as they traditionally were portrayed, as being the strong, manly sorts who were heroes, who were genuine heroes, because the Captain America film proved that was very successful, and in my opinion could be done really well as a story. Like he can be an interesting character. If you have, and Captain America's played very, very straight. He is the cowboy, right? He is the all-American Boy Scout kind of a thing. Whether you liked it or not, and for the record, I did like it a lot, and I'll probably make a video on it or something someday, or maybe at least write something on it. Man of Steel proved that depicting the straight-faced, straightforward, honest, just, virtuous hero, not the dark, I mean, he's conflicted, but, like, not the one that's mitigated or ridiculed or satirized, just playing it straight, is at least lucrative. Will at least make you money. Again, in my opinion, Man of Steel is actually a great movie, but Catholics all like this movie for the most part, Man of Steel. So, if the Lone Ranger movie was going to do the same thing as the Green Hornet, which wasn't that successful as I understand, I know Seth Rogen has no interest in doing a sequel, where it takes this kind of traditional character with a supposedly racist psychic and inverts it where the psychic becomes awesome and the white guy becomes clumsy and incompetent. That's not that lucrative, and I think it's in some ways too bad that there couldn't have been a Lone Ranger movie that basically made another Clayton Moore. I mean, to see Armie Hammer do a Clayton Moore impression, but for all that, it is worth mentioning, and I guess I'll close on this note, that when the rights to the Lone Ranger character were sold in the 70s or the 80s, Clayton Moore had been doing public appearances as the Lone Ranger, and the guys who bought the rights told him to stop. And he thought that was nonsense, and so he stopped wearing the mask, but he still wore like sunglasses and still made public appearances as the Lone Ranger character, basically. And I think he ended up suing, and he won. He won the rights to continue to go out as the Lone Ranger in public. He was the Lone Ranger. Again, it's on his Hollywood star. And they made a movie in 1981 or 82, The Legend of the Lone Ranger, that tried to reboot the franchise, and nobody liked it, and nobody remembers it, and it didn't make any money. And 30 years later, they made a new Lone Ranger movie that is also not making any money. This movie will probably be forgotten, or at least people won't really... Well, it might be remembered as a box office bomb. It doesn't deserve to be hated, in my opinion, but for what it's worth, the original Lone Ranger, to people who know who the Lone Ranger is, and I'm sure there are still... I mean, probably a lot of kids don't know who he is or only know him through this movie, but I mean, I'm sure there's people like my friend who lived out in the country, grew up on a farm, who are going to grow up watching the Lone Ranger, and it'll always be Clayton Moore. I mean, Clayton Moore will always be the Lone Ranger, and especially with YouTube, I mean, those old shows and those old radio shows, they're never going away. So it's sort of like there's the story about Raymond Chandler or one of these other crime writers, and a journalist asked him, aren't you angry that Hollywood destroyed your books? And he turns and looks at his bookshelf with a row of his own books, and he says, they didn't destroy them, they're right there. And same thing in this. The Lone Ranger will always be Clayton Moore. Those will always be around. Those will always be fine. This movie's not going to wreck that, even though in some ways it did its best to. But for all that, I enjoyed it. It was not as bad as I feared it would be. I'd recommend it if you go with a group of friends, or probably save it for Netflix, honestly. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Take care.